Hello everyone, and a warm welcome to the Complex in MA channel. If you're new here, please consider subscribing and hitting that like button to show your support. Today, we are going to be discussing the film Jejak Rasa yang Hilang. The film unfolds with a quiet intensity, drawing us into the meticulous world of culinary artistry, where memory and flavor are inextricably linked. We are introduced to the protagonist, a chef whose reputation precedes him, known for an almost obsessive dedication to traditional Indonesian flavors, particularly those rooted in the Minangkabau heritage of West Sumatra. His cooking isn't just sustenance, it's a form of narrative, a way to keep the past alive. This dedication, we soon learn, is fueled by a deep, almost painful nostalgia, a yearning for a taste only his grandmother could perfectly evoke. His journey is not a straightforward rise to fame, but rather an internal struggle reflected in the precise calibration of spices. We see glimpses of his early training, perhaps absorbing techniques from seasoned masters in bustling city kitchens. Yet always feeling a fundamental piece was missing, the authentic rasa, the soul of the flavor. This drives him to seek out the origins, the ancestral recipes that have been diluted or lost in modern interpretations. The narrative gains momentum when he encounters a younger character, perhaps a food critic or a fellow aspiring chef, someone who represents the contemporary appreciation for fusion and rapid innovation. This juxtaposition is crucial. One clings to the immutable past, the other races toward an unknown future. Their initial interactions are marked by professional skepticism, the veteran dismissing the newcomer's work as superficial, while the younger generation views the traditionalist as stagnant. A turning point arrives through the discovery of an old, perhaps partially burned, recipe book or a crucial, almost mythical, ingredient source hidden deep within the Minangkabau highlands. This quest takes the protagonist away from the sterile environment of fine dining and into the vibrant, challenging landscape of rural life, forcing him to reconnect with the land and the people whose lives are interwoven with the ingredients themselves. He revisits old techniques, slow smoking, specific fermentation processes that require patience, a commodity often lacking in the fast-paced culinary world he left behind. As he painstakingly recreates the lost flavors, guided by fragmented memories and the wisdom of village elders, the film subtly explores themes of legacy and identity. His professional ambition transforms into a desire for filial piety, a way to honor the spirit of his grandmother, who likely inspired him not just with her cooking, but with her resilience and connection to her community. We witness the transformation not just in the food he produces, which becomes richer and more resonant, but in the chef himself. The rigidity softens, replaced by a profound understanding that true mastery lies in interpretation, not mere replication. The climax isn't a grand culinary competition, but rather an intimate sharing of food, perhaps a meal prepared for the very community that preserved the knowledge he sought. The younger character, initially skeptical, tastes the food and experiences a moment of genuine revelation, finally understanding the depth beneath the traditional facade. The film suggests that the true lost flavor wasn't just a spice blend, but the context, the love, and the shared history embedded in every mouthful. The narrative concludes not with eternal success, but with a quiet acceptance. The flavor has been rediscovered, the memory honored, and the legacy passed on, ensuring that the Jejak Rasa, the trace of flavor, will endure. The air in the protagonist's kitchen, even in his celebrated establishment, always seemed faintly charged with the ghost of wood smoke, a testament to the culinary pilgrimage he was perpetually undertaking. He was a man carved from discipline, his hands bearing the faint scars of countless burns, each one a minor punctuation mark in the epic poem of his dedication to ancestral cooking. His inspiration, the spectral presence in every perfectly balanced sample, was his grandmother, a woman whose kitchen was the very epicenter of their world, a place where patience wasn't a virtue, but the primary cooking medium. She wasn't a famous chef. She was the keeper of the flame, her knowledge passed down through shared silence and the rhythmic pounding of mortar and pestle. The younger foil, perhaps named Ryan, represented the glossy, highly publicized world of modern gastronomy, a chef who favored molecular foams over slow reductions, whose inspiration was drawn from international glossy magazines rather than the earth beneath his feet. When Ryan first sampled the protagonist's rendition of a classic rendang, he likely critiqued its texture as too rustic, missing the foundational truth that the roughness was the integrity itself. The older chef's frustration wasn't merely professional, it was existential. He felt that by chasing accolades in sterile environments, he was allowing the very soul of his heritage to evaporate into the high-altitude air of elite dining rooms. The quest for the elusive ingredient led them not to a supplier, but to a matriarch deep in the valleys, an elder whose memory was sharper than any cookbook. This woman didn't measure in grams. She measured in feelings, in the humidity of the morning, in the sound the coconut milk made when it kissed the searing wok. The journey demanded physical sacrifice from the protagonist, forcing him to shed the pampered skin of the successful urban chef. He found himself sleeping on woven mats, his usually immaculate chef whites stained with the red earth, learning to coax flavor from ingredients he'd previously dismissed as mere raw materials. The real revelation wasn't the final recipe, but the understanding that the intensity of the taste was directly proportional to the human connection woven into its making. When the elder finally shared the forgotten preparation method, perhaps involving the unique curing of a specific type of local chili using rainwater collected only during the monsoon season, the emotion that washed over the protagonist was profound relief mixed with sorrow. It was the feeling of grasping something vital just before it slipped away forever. This wasn't just about seasoning a dish. It was about resecuring his place in the lineage, proving to the ghost of his grandmother that her arduous life's work hadn't been in vain. Ryan, witnessing this near-religious devotion, begins to understand that innovation without roots is just noise. When he finally tastes the dish, prepared under the guidance of the protagonist and the watchful eye of the elder, his sophisticated palate is momentarily silenced. It's not just flavor, it's memory made edible, a complex tapestry of smoke, earth, and unspoken love that transcends mere technique. The film leaves us with the quiet dignity of a tradition successfully carried forward, not as a museum piece, but as a living, breathing expression of identity sustained by the careful tending of its past. The protagonist carried the weight of his entire culinary lineage on his shoulders, a burden that manifested in the perpetual tension around his jawline. His focus was often so intense that the hustle of his acclaimed restaurant seemed to recede around him, leaving him isolated in the precise geometry of his plating. We glimpse moments, perhaps late at night, when the stainless steel counters reflected the harsh overhead light, where he would close his eyes, trying desperately to isolate the exact inflection in his grandmother's voice when she spoke of the importance of santan, the coconut cream. She wasn't just teaching him to cook, she was instilling a philosophy where waste was a sin, and every ingredient possessed a spirit that demanded respect. Ryan, the young modernist, initially viewed the older chef's adherence to tradition as a form of self-imposed mediocrity. Ryan's ambition was fueled by global recognition. He dreamed of Michelin stars whispered about in distant, snow-capped cities, while the protagonist was obsessed with the approval of the ancestors whispering in the smoke of the hearth. Ryan's early attempts to elevate Minangkabau dishes involved replacing crucial, slow-rendered fats with lighter oils, a modernization that the older chef viewed as nothing less than cultural erasure. The clash was passionate, sometimes erupting into sharp exchanges over the proper aging of dried spices, where Ryan saw tedious bureaucracy and the protagonist saw sacred ritual. The descent into the highlands was physically taxing for the established chef. His designer chef shoes were ruined almost immediately on the muddy paths leading to the source of the special turmeric they needed, a variety that only grew on slopes irrigated by a particular mineral spring. He had to learn to communicate not through technical culinary jargon, but through gestures and patience with the local farmers, whose relationship with the earth was instinctive and unbroken. There was a poignant scene where, having failed repeatedly to extract the right intensity of flavor from a new batch of herbs, he breaks down, admitting to the village elder that his years of formal training have made him deaf to the subtler cues of nature. It was a moment of professional humility that unlocked the true sensory pathway. The elder woman, whose hands were gnarled like ancient tree roots, didn't offer solutions. She offered experiences. She made the chef chew on raw, unwashed roots until he could distinguish the inherent bitterness from the desired earthiness. This sensory overload served to strip away the intellectual layers he had built around his craft. He realized that the lost flavor was less about a specific ingredient and more about the unhurried reverence afforded to the preparation process. The final meal they prepared together was not meant for critique. It was an offering. When Ryan finally tasted it, a humble stew elevated by perfect textural balance and deep, layered umami, his usual stream of analytical commentary ceased. He didn't speak of mouthfeel or presentation. He simply closed his eyes, a rare, genuine moment of quiet awe, replacing his habitual bravado. The enduring power of the film lies in this silent communication. The flavor, rediscovered, acted as the only necessary language, bridging the generational and ideological gap with a single, perfect taste. The resolution brought a quiet transformation, not the triumphant roar of a victorious chef, but the deep, resonant hum of a debt repaid to memory. The protagonist, having shed the armor of his urban success, returned to the city not to flaunt his newfound knowledge, but to integrate it seamlessly. His restaurant menu subtly shifted. The dramatic flair remained, the meticulous presentation still evident. But beneath the surface, the foundation was entirely different. Slower, deeper, more honest. Patrons, accustomed to his prior brilliance, began noticing a profound difference. The food now had a haunting persistence on the palate, an almost narrative quality that spoke of journeys and soil. Ryan, significantly altered by his immersion in the highlands, became the unlikely bridge between the past and the future. He stopped chasing the transient trends that dominated the culinary press, and instead began championing slow food principles, albeit filtered through his modernist lens. We see him later, perhaps months onward, using the elder's techniques to stabilize a delicate foam or incorporate locally foraged, wild ingredients into a dish that still retained international appeal. He didn't abandon his modern education. Rather, he realized that true innovation wasn't about discarding history, but about understanding its absolute limits and possibilities. His respect for the older chef was now genuine, rooted in shared physical experience, rather than grudging acknowledgement of skill. The grandmother spirit found its truest expression in the protagonist's newfound ease. The perpetual tension around his jaw relaxed. The obsessive need for external validation faded, replaced by the quiet satisfaction of authenticity. He started mentoring younger cooks, emphasizing not just knife skills or temperature control, but the importance of listening, listening to the bubbling of the broth, listening to the rhythm of the growing season, listening to the silence that held the essential instructions. His culinary legacy was no longer about achieving a specific taste, but about fostering the conditions under which that taste could naturally arise again. The film closes not with a sweeping shot of a successful restaurant, but perhaps with the protagonist sitting alone in his kitchen after closing, tending to a slow-simmering pot. The sound of the gentle heat, the only soundtrack, suggesting that the journey of preserving the Jejak Rasa is perpetual, a quiet daily act of devotion, ensuring that the echoes of tradition continue to flavor the present moment. The passing of time seemed to treat the protagonist's rediscovered kitchen as sacred ground, a space where haste was an anathema. The subtle recalibrations he made to his establishment were less about profit margins and more about temporal integrity. He insisted that certain spice blends, once ground quickly by powerful machinery, now needed to mature for weeks, absorbing the ambient humidity of the storeroom, a space he personally tended, treating the jars of dried leaves and roots with the reverence one might afford ancient manuscripts. He found that this enforced slowness acted as a natural sieve, weeding out the demanding, impatient elements of his staff, leaving only those truly dedicated to the craft's long game. His own demeanor softened further. The sharp edges of the perfectionist were worn down by the patient rhythm of traditional preparation, replaced by the grounded confidence of someone who has finally made peace with the unhurried processes of nature. Ryan's evolution was equally compelling, transforming him from a culinary prodigy into a thoughtful interpreter. He didn't just adopt the old methods, he synthesized them. We see him in his own burgeoning space, perhaps a smaller, more focused venue, where he utilizes advanced sous vide techniques not to shortcut flavor development, but to perfectly maintain the integrity of ingredients that have been meticulously sourced using the knowledge he gained in the Highlands. His plating retained its artistic flair, but the foundation, the underlying broth or marinade, was now imbued with the profound, slow-cooked depth taught by the elder. His past critics, who once lauded his novelty, now praised the unexpected soulfulness in his creations, recognizing that his modernity was now anchored by an undeniable, earthy ballast. The most poignant continuation of the narrative concerned the role of memory itself. The protagonist realized his grandmother's true gift wasn't a secret ingredient, but the ability to instill absolute focus, a pure presence in the act of cooking. He began incorporating rituals into his kitchen's opening routine, a shared moment of silence before service, not just to focus the minds, but to symbolically acknowledge the sources of their ingredients and the hands that cultivated them. This was a silent communication to his grandmother, a living acknowledgement that her lessons were being absorbed not just by his hands, but by the collective consciousness of his brigade. The lost flavor, he finally understood, was the flavor of undivided attention, an increasingly rare commodity in their hyper-connected world. The final image is not necessarily of the chef receiving applause, but perhaps of him teaching a young apprentice how to properly crush galangal, demonstrating the exact pressure required to release the inner oil without bruising the fiber, a transfer of nuanced, embodied knowledge, ensuring the faint, precious trace of flavor endures not as a historical artifact, but as a living, breathing practice. The lingering scent in the protagonist's revived kitchen was now less ghost and more an anchoring presence, a constant reminder of the soil and the slow fire. His relationship with time had completely inverted. Where before, he raced against clocks and reservations, now the clock dictated the pace of the ingredients. He invested heavily in preserving the traditional tools, not out of simple nostalgia, but because he understood their physical interaction with the food imparted a unique, textural quality that no modern machine could replicate. He'd often spend mornings with a worn wooden mortar and pestle, grinding spices by hand, finding a meditative rhythm that quieted the internal monologue of ambition that had previously driven him. This physical labor was a form of penance, a way to earn back the authenticity he felt he had momentarily betrayed in his pursuit of external validation. Rian, meanwhile, had found a compelling synthesis. His restaurant, though sleek and contemporary, began featuring small, almost hidden tributes to the slow arts. A refined clear broth, served as an amuse-bouche, would possess an almost unbelievable depth, the result of a 48-hour reduction based on the elders' principles, clarified through painstaking modern filtration. He spoke openly in interviews about the unquantifiable variables that separated excellent food from truly memorable food, directly referencing the Minangkabau wisdom he'd absorbed. He became a vital advocate, arguing that high-level cuisine didn't need to abandon its cultural roots, but rather should use global techniques to amplify local truths. His earlier flippancy was replaced by a deep, almost scholarly respect for the complexity embedded in simple, time-honored methods. The relationship between the two chefs matured into a genuine mentorship, framed by shared silence over steaming pots. The protagonist saw in Ryan not a rival, but the necessary vessel for carrying the tradition forward into a world that valued speed. He stopped viewing Ryan's modern tools with suspicion and started seeing them as potential accelerators for flavor extraction, provided the groundwork of patience was laid first. In a quiet gesture of acceptance, the protagonist gifted Ryan a small, beautifully aged wooden box containing the very first batch of turmeric harvested during their Highland expedition, a silent acknowledgement of shared struggle and ultimate success. The film's final emotional resonance is found in the subtle shift in how the protagonist eats his own food. He no longer analyzes the balance or judges the execution. He simply consumes, allowing the wave of flavor to transport him. When he tastes a familiar dish now, the memory of his grandmother is no longer a painful, unattainable ideal, but a warm, present reality. He has stopped chasing the lost flavor and has instead become the living embodiment of its continuity. The narrative concludes not with a grand culinary finale, but with a simple, profound realization shared between the two chefs as they watched the first morning light hit the herbs drying on the back patio. The true taste that was lost was the connection itself, and by reconnecting with the earth and the lineage, the flavor had never truly left. It was merely waiting to be honored back into existence. The protagonist's renewed focus on the tangible and the slow brought an almost monastic quality to his daily routine. He began sourcing his salt directly from coastal communities, not just for its mineral content, but for the stories the salt harvesters shared, tales of tides and weather that informed the salt's character. This meticulous sourcing extended to every element. He understood that a dish built on external perfection would always collapse under scrutiny, whereas a dish built on authentic provenance possessed an internal, unshakable integrity. His staff, now lean and highly specialized, moved with a choreographed grace that seemed antithetical to the high-pressure environment of a top-tier city kitchen, their movements dictated by the simmer, not the ticket machine. The very texture of their daily work had become a form of storytelling. Ryan, embracing his role as the cultural translator, started lecturing at culinary institutes, using holographic models to demonstrate the molecular breakdown of slow-cooked proteins, alongside ancient fermentation techniques. He never presented the old ways as charming relics. Instead, he framed them as superior, time-tested technology. His success became a validation for the protagonist, proof that deep heritage, when presented with clarity and intelligence, could captivate the global palate more effectively than any fleeting trend. Ryan often brought his new apprentices to the established chef's kitchen, not for a formal lesson, but simply for them to observe the near-silent communication between the protagonist and his oldest sous chef, a shared language built on years of mutual culinary respect. The connection to the elder woman in the Highlands became a sustained dialogue rather than a singular discovery. Regular, respectful shipments of high-quality urban supplies, perhaps rare imported vinegars or specific finishing oils, were sent to her village, a reciprocal gesture recognizing that tradition requires nurturing from the outside world as well. This sustained relationship underlined a key theme, that heritage isn't static. It must be actively maintained across different spheres of life. The protagonist found a deep, quiet satisfaction in this exchange, realizing that his greatest contribution wasn't just cooking, but ensuring the pathway for that unique knowledge to remain viable in its source community. Emotionally, the protagonist carried a final, subtle melancholy, the realization that his grandmother was gone, yet his relationship with her had never been stronger. The gap between them had closed, filled by the food itself. The lingering, subtle flavor of loss was now intertwined with the flavor of fulfillment. In the film's closing moments, we see the protagonist watching Ryan confidently guide a new generation, his face relaxed, the ghost of anxiety finally lifted. The Jejak Rasa was secured. It wasn't just preserved in his restaurant, but actively radiating outward through the young chef he had mentored, ensuring the flavor memory would continue to mutate and survive in countless new forms, forever honoring the earth from which it first sprang. The protagonist's final professional act, before settling into a rhythm of deep, self-directed study, involved a public acknowledgement that transcended a mere award ceremony or a glowing review. He orchestrated a quiet, invitation-only tasting event at his restaurant, deliberately keeping the guest list small, focused on the few remaining culinary figures who still dismissed traditional Indonesian cooking as mere regional fare. He served only one dish, a distillation of everything he had learned, a dish so complex in its simplicity that it defied easy categorization. It was his grandmother's signature, perfected through the wisdom of the Highlands elder, cooked with the technical precision honed in the city, and framed by the philosophical understanding earned through struggle. The intensity of the dish wasn't immediately obvious. It demanded contemplation. One influential critic, known for his hyperbolic praise of avant-garde plating, reportedly took a bite and simply put his fork down, staring into the middle distance for several minutes. The flavor profile was described later, in hushed tones, as tasting like a perfectly remembered summer afternoon. It wasn't loud, it was resonant, suggesting layers of time and intention that no amount of expensive ingredients or quick technique could manufacture. This was the ultimate victory, not convincing the world of his skill, but embedding a piece of his ancestral soul so deeply into the food that it commanded respect without demanding attention. Ryan, observing from the periphery, saw this silent victory as the ultimate lesson in mastery. He understood that the chef had achieved something far greater than a star rating. He had achieved resonance. Ryan, now increasingly renowned, dedicated a portion of his own growing profits to establishing a foundation aimed at documenting and digitizing oral culinary knowledge before it vanished. His work was no longer about fusing, but about safeguarding the source material, the very stories and rituals that underpinned the flavor matrix. He saw himself as the necessary librarian for the traditions the protagonist had saved and resurrected. The protagonist eventually stepped back from the daily management of his flagship restaurant, delegating the running of the kitchen to trusted disciples who understood the sacred nature of the slow process. He retreated to a modest, purpose-built space, less a kitchen, more a dedicated laboratory for historical flavor reconstruction. Here, surrounded by maps, antique cooking implements, and samples of rare heirloom chili varieties, he focused solely on the theoretical underpinnings of Minangkabau cuisine. He wasn't cooking for diners anymore. He was cooking for posterity, meticulously recording variables of humidity, soil temperature, and even the phase of the moon, attempting to create a comprehensive guide that explained the why behind the how. The final scene mirrors the quiet beginning. The protagonist is alone, perhaps preparing a small meal for himself, utilizing a technique so ancient it predates recorded history in the region. He stirs a simple pot, the action flowing effortlessly. There is no anxiety, no striving for perfection, only being present. The camera lingers on his face, which finally holds a piece that reflects the deep, satisfying flavor he has cultivated in his life. The flavor of belonging, of memory made tangible, and the quiet triumph of honoring a legacy against the relentless rush of modernity. The trace of flavor, the Jejak Rasa, is no longer an object of pursuit, but the very atmosphere in which he now breathes. The quiet laboratory the protagonist established became less a kitchen and more a sanctuary for forgotten sensory data. He hung maps charting the historical migrations of his people across Sumatra, connecting geographical shifts to subtle changes in indigenous spice utilization, a true culinary archaeology. His most prized possessions were the few remaining handwritten notes from his grandmother, fragile scraps of paper containing not precise measurements, but cryptic references like "use the chill of the dawn" or "cook until the shadow of the mango tree touches the edge of the pot." He painstakingly interpreted these poetic directives, correlating them with modern meteorological readings, attempting to quantify intuition. The overwhelming emotion now wasn't striving, but a profound, almost academic curiosity mixed with a deep, abiding gratitude for the knowledge that had survived despite centuries of upheaval. Ryan's foundation flourished, becoming an essential partner to the protagonist's research. He used digital imaging and spectroscopic analysis to map the volatile aromatic compounds in spices cured using the elder woman's methods versus conventionally treated ones. Ryan's public persona shifted from that of a flashy innovator to a cultural conservationist. He became eloquent in explaining that the essence of terroir extended beyond wine regions, deeply embedding itself in the very structure of traditional cooking mediums. He championed the use of heirloom grains and underutilized regional vegetables, transforming his menus into living exhibits of agricultural history, all while maintaining the visual elegance that first brought him attention. This collaboration represented the perfect, symbiotic relationship, the past providing the unbreakable foundation, and the future providing the tools for its documentation and dissemination. One significant realization for the protagonist came during his study of fermentation. He discovered that the specific native yeasts present in the air of his grandmother's original home, yeasts that simply do not exist in the sterilized, climate-controlled environment of his urban laboratory, were crucial to achieving the authentic tang in certain fermented pastes. This forced an unusual step. Ryan helped finance the construction of a specialized, highly filtered, but traditionally ventilated annex connected to the laboratory, designed to replicate the atmospheric conditions of the ancestral highlands, a miniature ecosystem dedicated solely to microbial heritage. This acknowledgement of the environment's role underscored the fragility of true flavor. It was never just the ingredients, but the precise, irreplaceable where and when. The narrative finds its emotional peak not in a grand pronouncement, but in a simple shared moment. Ryan, during a visit to the lab, accidentally knocks over a small, carefully labeled jar containing a powdered root the protagonist had spent months isolating. Instead of the expected outburst of frustration, the protagonist merely sighs, a sound devoid of anger, filled only with weary understanding. He simply points to a second, identical jar. "Patience," he murmurs, echoing the elder's frequent advice. "It is the only ingredient that cannot be rushed, and the only one that cannot truly be replaced." This moment signifies his complete transcendence of ego. The knowledge is no longer his property to guard jealously, but a force of nature to be respected and carefully channeled, ensuring that the trace of that irreplaceable taste will continue to inform and enrich generations beyond his own. The final phase of the protagonist's life in the research space settled into a profound, almost monastic routine, where the pursuit of flavor became synonymous with the pursuit of historical truth. He treated the air itself as an ingredient, carefully monitoring minute fluctuations in temperature and humidity within the specialized annex, recognizing that the very breath of the highlands, captured through Ryan's technology, was the catalyst for unlocking the deepest layers of taste. He began to view his historical isolation not as a personal journey, but as a critical act of preservation, akin to cataloging endangered manuscripts. His focus narrowed to the nuances of cooking fats, understanding that the slow rendering of specific local animal fats, a practice largely abandoned in favor of industrialized oils, provided an essential, non-transferable mouthfeel that carried the volatile aromatics of the spices. He recorded hours of observation, his handwriting growing looser, less rigidly controlled, mirroring the freedom he felt in his understanding. Ryan, now operating as the public face of this culinary revival, used his growing influence to lobby for agricultural protection of the heirloom varieties the protagonist was studying. He staged demonstrations where he would prepare the same dish using 3 different fats: the traditional rendered fat, a modern vegetable oil, and a high-end imported butter, allowing chefs and patrons to literally taste the decades of culinary drift. The stark contrast, particularly in the way the flavors aged on the palate, served as a compelling, undeniable argument for cultural preservation over mere modernization. His passion was no longer about trend-setting, but about ensuring a future where the raw materials for true flavor creation still existed outside of a laboratory setting. He often spoke of the protagonist not as a mentor, but as a cultural custodian whose work had pulled an entire culinary identity back from the brink of abstraction. The emotional culmination arrived subtly, almost unnoticed by the outside world. One afternoon, while testing the efficacy of a freshly cultivated batch of the rare Minangkabau chili, cured exactly according to the elder woman's forgotten method, the protagonist found himself momentarily overwhelmed, not by nostalgia, but by a sense of completion. He recognized that the essence of his grandmother's cooking wasn't her skill, but her unwavering belief in the process. He finally understood that the lost flavor was the pure, uncompromised intention which the chaos of modernity had obscured. He looked at the resulting chili paste, vibrant and intensely fragrant, and felt no urge to taste it immediately. The satisfaction was in knowing that the potential was perfectly realized. In the film's closing moments, the protagonist is seen stepping out of his laboratory for the first time in months, blinking against the bright city sunlight. He doesn't return to the formal dining room or the research annex. Instead, he walks to a small, unassuming community garden Rian had helped fund, where an older generation of local farmers is tending small plots of heirloom herbs. He kneels beside one of the gardeners, not as a famous chef or a researcher, but simply as a fellow caretaker. He doesn't speak of complex reduction techniques or molecular composition. Instead, he gently touches the soil, recognizing it as the first, non-negotiable step in the chain of flavor. The camera pulls back as he smiles, a genuine, unforced expression of peace. The Jejak Rasa has become rooted. It is no longer a memory to be chased, but the living ground upon which the next generation can build, knowing exactly what they stand upon. The quietude of the protagonist's final phase was punctuated by the soft, rhythmic sounds of planting and turning earth, a soundtrack far removed from the clamor of professional kitchens he once commanded. His retirement from the public eye was not a retreat from engagement, but a deeper immersion into the source. He treated the community garden not as a hobby plot, but as a living archive, working alongside the farmers whose ancestors had cultivated these very seeds long before the concept of fine dining existed. He learned from them the agricultural poetry, the timing of companion planting, the silent language of soil exhaustion, and the specific prayers offered before a major harvest. Knowledge that existed entirely outside the measurable metrics of his scientific studies. This final apprenticeship was humbling, requiring him to trade the authority of the stove for the deference due to the land itself. Rian, meanwhile, had elevated his role to that of a dynamic cultural ambassador. He often featured the garden's produce in his most exclusive tasting menus, dedicating entire courses to the rediscovery of a single heirloom vegetable, explaining its history and the near extinction it faced before the protagonist's research illuminated its culinary worth. Ryan's presentation style evolved to match the gravity of his material. His explanations were now laced with deep reverence, steering clear of jargon, favoring instead the narrative of survival and continuity. He consciously used his global platform to advocate for biodiversity, framing the preservation of regional ingredients as a matter of global culinary security, a necessary defense against monoculture and flavor homogenization. The true measure of the protagonist's success was often seen in the next generation of young cooks who sought him out, not for the signature techniques of his famous restaurant, but for guidance on how to listen to ingredients. They would arrive expecting complex formulas, only to be given chores, weeding a stubborn patch of ground, washing roots until they shone, or sitting for hours simply observing the slow bloom of yeast in the dedicated annex. He taught them that mastery was not about adding complexity, but about removing everything that obscured the ingredient's inherent truth. He instilled in them the ethic that every dish must first honor its origin, regardless of the final presentation, a foundational lesson he had learned at the feet of his grandmother and confirmed in the Highlands. The film concludes not with a grand closing statement, but with an intimate scene emphasizing continuity. Years have passed. Ryan, now an established leader in sustainable gastronomy, brings his own young apprentice, a quiet, observant girl, to the community garden. The protagonist, now showing the gentle signs of age, is showing the child how to carefully select ripe fruits, his hands moving with the same practiced reverence he once reserved for plating. He doesn't speak much. The lessons are embedded in the touch, the shared focus. As the sun sets, casting long shadows across the fertile rows, the protagonist hands the child a freshly picked fruit, perfectly ripe. The girl takes a bite, her eyes widening slightly, not in shock, but in deep recognition. The flavor is ancient, familiar, and absolutely alive. The Jejak Rasa is not just preserved, it has propagated, finding new ground to take root, ensuring that the deep, resonant taste of connection will continue to shape the culinary future. The protagonist, now fully integrated into the rhythm of the garden, bore the patina of time beautifully. The scars on his hands, once sharp reminders of kitchen hazards, had softened, overlaid by the calluses of honest labor with soil and hand tools. His face, once taut with the pressure of Michelin expectations, was now lined by the sun and etched with the steady contentment of purpose found. He moved with a deliberate, unhurried grace, a living testament to the fact that true culinary excellence originates not from frantic innovation, but from profound patience. He often carried a small, hand-bound notebook, not filled with recipes, but with observations on insect life cycles and the exact angle of sunlight required to bring out the sweetness in a specific variety of chili, a new form of meticulous record-keeping that felt more essential than any prior culinary decree. Ryan, reflecting the protagonist's wisdom through his own global lens, had become a master synthesizer. His restaurant was no longer just modern, it was rooted. He instituted an annual lineage dinner where the menu was built entirely around the week's harvest from the community garden, each plate accompanied by a narrative not of technique, but of geography and lineage. His composure during service was remarkable. The frantic energy that once defined young, ambitious chefs was absent. When a demanding guest questioned the simplicity of a particular preparation, Ryan would calmly explain, "This is not simple. This is the result of 5 centuries of accrued wisdom distilled into one perfect bite. We are merely the facilitators." He carried the torch, not by mimicking the past, but by building a vibrant future worthy of it. The relationship between the two men achieved a state of near telepathic understanding. There were no more debates over methodology. When Ryan encountered a technical hurdle in preserving a delicate local flavor during long-distance transport, he didn't call a food scientist, he called the protagonist. The older man would offer a cryptic suggestion, perhaps referencing how his grandmother used specific tree sap to seal earthenware, which Ryan would then translate using modern biochemical principles, invariably achieving success. Their collaboration was the tangible proof that true innovation is often just the respectful rediscovery of forgotten context. The most emotionally resonant aspect of their later years was the quiet acknowledgement of the community's role. The protagonist realized that his grandmother's kitchen was only the epicenter because the community surrounded it, supplying the raw materials and the cultural context. He began hosting quarterly gatherings in the garden, bringing together the elderly farmers, Ryan's young, tech-savvy apprentices, and the few remaining chefs dedicated to authentic regional cuisine. These were not formal workshops, but feasts where stories were traded as freely as the food. The laughter was rich, the conversations deep, a celebration of a culture that had successfully navigated the treacherous waters between rapid globalization and essential self-preservation. The film ends not with a singular focus on either man, but on the intergenerational act of sharing. The protagonist watches the young apprentice, Ryan's protégé, tasting the first fruit he helped nurture. Her expression is the echo of his grandmother's silent approval, a look of pure, unadulterated connection to the earth and the history contained within that simple taste. The final shot is a slow, upward pan from the soil, through the ripening fruit, across the faces of the connected generations, finally resting on the vast, open sky above the garden. The Jejak Rasa is no longer a trace. It is the fertile ground itself, ensuring that the memory remains not just edible, but sustainable, passed on through the continuity of care. The film, Jejak Rasa Yang Hilang, or The Trail of Lost Flavor, presents a surprisingly rich tapestry woven from threads of culinary tradition, personal memory, and the inevitable erosion caused by modernity. It functions less as a straightforward narrative and more as a sensory exploration, deeply informed by the cultural geography of its setting, which often feels as vital as any character. At the core of the film lies the quest, or perhaps the yearning, for authenticity in taste, a pursuit embodied by the protagonist, whose professional life seems ironically disconnected from the visceral connection to heritage he seeks. We see echoes of celebrated food documentarians and ethnographers, those who understand that flavor is not merely biochemistry, but a stored cultural language. The meticulous recreation of ancestral recipes serves as the primary dramatic engine, each step loaded with significance. This deliberate pacing, mirroring the slow, careful process of traditional cooking, forces the viewer into a meditative state, contrasting sharply with the rapid pace of contemporary life the film implicitly critiques. The director's aesthetic choices are crucial here. The cinematography often bathes the preparation scenes in a warm, almost sepia-toned light, invoking nostalgia without resorting to overt sentimentality. This visual language suggests that the lost flavor isn't truly gone, merely obscured by layers of convenience and speed. When we examine the background of the principal actors involved, particularly those portraying the elders who hold the keys to these forgotten techniques, we recognize the importance of casting individuals who carry the genuine gravitas of tradition, rather than actors merely mimicking it. This authenticity extends beyond performance into the very mise-en-scène of the kitchens depicted. The film subtly explores themes familiar in the works of auteurs preoccupied with cultural preservation, drawing parallels to cinematographers who focus on the dignity of manual labor. The hands shown kneading dough or grinding spices are treated with the same reverence one might afford a painter's brush. They are instruments of legacy. The central conflict isn't truly between characters, but between the memory of a perfect taste and the imperfect reality of replicating it in the present day. This struggle taps into a universal human anxiety, the fear that the knowledge passed down through generations, the unspoken recipes, the feel of the right temperature, will vanish with the last practitioner. Furthermore, the narrative structure often employs flashbacks linked explicitly to taste memory. A particular spice triggers a memory of childhood, placing the audience directly inside the protagonist's subjective experience. This technique elevates the film from a simple cooking documentary into a profound meditation on how sensory experience anchors identity. The lost flavor symbolizes not just a culinary gap, but a lost part of the self, a connection to roots severed by migration or economic necessity. In its final moments, the film suggests that the true trail of flavor is not about achieving perfect replication, but about the dedicated act of searching and sharing the process. The journey itself, the respectful inquiry into the past, becomes the preservation. It implies that the flavor is regenerated through the act of mindful creation, ensuring that even if the precise ingredient combination fades, the respect for the slow, careful cultivation of tradition endures, echoing the enduring legacy found in the best works of filmmakers who prioritize atmosphere and texture over plot mechanics. The emotional weight carried by the protagonist is palpable. He is not merely attempting a culinary challenge, but undertaking a personal excavation. One can sense the burden of expectation, perhaps inheriting the mantle from a revered family figure whose shadow looms large over every simmering pot. This internal drama is often conveyed through subtle shifts in his demeanor, a momentary hesitation before adding salt, a flicker of frustration when a texture doesn't yield as expected. His background hinted at as being rooted in a more modern, perhaps even corporate pursuit, a career requiring precision but lacking soul, makes his return to the earthiness of traditional methods all the more poignant. He represents the educated generation grappling with the vacuum left by rapid industrialization, realizing that technical skill cannot substitute for inherited intuition. The secondary characters, the custodians of the old ways, are beautifully sketched, avoiding the cliché of the wise, inert sage. They possess a vibrant, sometimes stubborn energy. Consider the elder woman responsible for the fermentation process. Her fingers, gnarled by years of work, move with an economy of motion that speaks volumes about efficiency honed over decades, a master class in embodied knowledge. Her initial skepticism towards the protagonist's formalized approach is a necessary friction, a gatekeeping mechanism ensuring that the knowledge is not taken lightly. This dynamic, the eager, sometimes clumsy student confronting the seasoned protective master, is a timeless narrative arc here transposed onto the kitchen table. The film masterfully utilizes sound design to amplify the sensory experience. The crunch of perfectly fried shallots, the rhythmic thud of a mortar and pestle, the gentle hiss of oil meeting hot metal. These are not just background noises, but active participants in the storytelling. They form the sonic map of the lost flavor, allowing the viewer's own memories of similar comforting sounds to surface. This meticulous auditory layering suggests the filmmaker possesses a deep respect for the acoustic ecology of traditional life, contrasting sharply with the often sterile soundscapes associated with modern food production. Furthermore, the visual juxtaposition between the protagonist's current, minimalist environment, perhaps a sterile stainless steel workspace, and the warm, cluttered, almost organically grown environment of the ancestral kitchen provides a recurring visual metaphor for the thematic tension. The former speaks of standardization and control. The latter whispers of adaptation and imperfection, which ironically leads to richer results. When the protagonist finally achieves a moment of breakthrough, perhaps tasting a dish that perfectly mirrors his earliest memory, the shot lingers, allowing the audience to absorb the emotional release. A quiet triumph, not of overcoming an external enemy, but of reconciling with one's own history. The film argues convincingly that true innovation in culture often demands a profound reverence for what has nearly been discarded. The emotional resonance of this cinematic journey is deeply tied to the concept of displacement, not just geographical, but temporal. The protagonist's obsession is fueled by a sense of being untethered, a common affliction for individuals whose formative years were spent navigating the demands of a globalized economy, which often necessitates the abandonment of localized tradition. His internal landscape appears haunted by the ghosts of past meals, the specific sunlight that filtered through the window during a grandmother's cooking lesson, the sound of a particular clay pot singing on the fire. These memories function as an emotional compass, guiding him through the confusion of the contemporary world. We perceive a vulnerability beneath his determined exterior, a fear that if he fails to recapture this flavor, he fails to fully access a foundational part of his identity. The supporting cast, particularly the older generation, are portrayed not as static repositories of wisdom, but as active, complex individuals wrestling with their own sense of obsolescence. One character, perhaps a former apprentice of the protagonist's mentor, might exhibit a sharp cynicism born from witnessing the rapid devaluation of their life's work. This character challenges the protagonist's idealism, arguing that true knowledge requires sacrifice. Sacrifices the modern seeker is perhaps unwilling or unable to make. This creates necessary dramatic friction. The pursuit of nostalgia can easily slip into romanticizing hardship, and the film thankfully avoids this trap by grounding the elder's expertise in tangible realities. Calloused hands, ingrained patience, and an intimate nonverbal understanding of ingredients. Consider the tactile quality of the film's representation of ingredients. We are given extreme close-ups of ingredients that feel almost erotic in their detail. The oily sheen on freshly pressed coconut milk, the granular texture of hand-pounded chili paste, the way steam clouds the camera lens, momentarily obscuring vision. a visual metaphor for the difficulty of truly seeing the past clearly. This commitment to texture suggests the director's own background might be rooted in art house cinema, or perhaps documentary work focused on craft, where the process itself is the subject. This is a director who understands that to capture a lost flavor, one must first capture the labor that created it. The film achieves its most profound moments not during the consumption of the final product, but during the communal preparation. These scenes depict a quiet, unspoken form of fellowship, where generations bridge the gulf of years through shared, rhythmic tasks. The protagonist, initially clumsy, slowly begins to integrate into this flow, his movements becoming less analytical and more intuitive. This integration is marked by subtle changes in his facial expression, the tightening jaw of concentration giving way to a relaxed focus. The flavor, then, is revealed to be less about a singular recipe and more about the quality of presence, the shared human intention poured into the act of sustenance. The narrative ultimately suggests that the lost flavor is recoverable only when one stops viewing tradition as a relic to be studied and starts treating it as a living practice to be inhabited. The cinematic journey culminates in a quiet, almost spiritual reckoning, where the protagonist must finally confront the very nature of memory and its unreliability. Having painstakingly followed the steps, utilized the traditional tools, and absorbed the elders' tacit knowledge, the moment of truth, the tasting, is fraught with unbearable tension. This final sensory evaluation is not merely a test of his acquired skill, it is a referendum on his entire recent existence. Does the taste perfectly match the idealized memory etched in his youth? Or is there a crucial, elusive element missing? If the taste is imperfect, the film shifts its focus from culinary retrieval to psychological acceptance. The realization dawns that the lost flavor was perhaps never purely chemical. It was inextricably bound to the context of its creation, the specific time, the emotional state of the cook, the very air of a long-vanished home. This mature understanding elevates the narrative beyond simple food fetishism. It acknowledges that some things are, by definition, unrecoverable, and that clinging too tightly to the past prevents the creation of a flavorful future. The protagonist's eventual expression in this moment, perhaps a gentle knowing smile rather than triumphant vindication, signifies this acceptance. He has honored the past by engaging with it fully, even if he cannot physically transplant it into the present. This resolution echoes the career trajectory of certain documentarians who transition from strict observational work to more personal, reflective filmmaking. The goal shifts from documenting reality to understanding its imprint on the observer. The film thus becomes a metaphor for cultural stewardship. Preservation is not about freezing moments in amber, but about integrating the lessons learned from those moments into the ongoing creation of culture. The protagonist, having shed the sterile armor of his former life, is now capable of carrying forward a refined, context-aware version of the tradition. He has not merely found a recipe, he has found a sustainable relationship with his own heritage, ensuring that the Jejak, the trail, remains visible even if the original footprint has been washed away by time. The closing shots, which might show him teaching a new, younger student, perhaps using a blend of old techniques and new insights, solidify this legacy, suggesting that the true flavor that was lost was the joy of sharing the pursuit itself. The film's lingering power resides in this suggestion of continuation, the gentle pivot from obsession to inheritance. The protagonist, now transformed, embodies a nuanced understanding of tradition that eludes the purely academic or the blindly nostalgic. His newfound calm is the most significant character development, a shedding of the tense, almost desperate energy that initially propelled him. Where before there was the anxious striving for exactitude, there is now the quiet confidence of someone who understands the inherent flexibility within strict forms. This shift allows for a more genuine connection with the younger generation he now mentors, perhaps a child or a student less burdened by the weight of idealized memory. The depiction of this mentorship phase is crucial, as it avoids the trap of merely replicating the master-apprentice dynamic seen earlier. The younger initiate might exhibit modern impatience, challenging the rationale behind seemingly archaic steps. Why use a hand-cranked mill when an electric one is available? The protagonist responds not with dogma, but with demonstration, showing how the friction of the older method alters the molecular structure of the spice in a way the modern tool homogenizes. This is where the film asserts its most potent argument. Tradition is not arbitrary. It is optimized knowledge accumulated through long empirical testing. The emotion conveyed here is one of quiet generosity, the relief of finally being able to transmit knowledge without the suffocating pressure of trying to resurrect the past for oneself. Visually, the color palette during these final scenes might soften further, moving away from the initial nostalgic warmth to a brighter, more diffused light, symbolizing clarity and future potential. The lingering focus on the shared meal, now relaxed and informal, speaks volumes. The anxieties of perfection have dissolved into the simple pleasure of consumption and community. The final lingering shot might focus on a shared ladle passing between hands, a silent acknowledgement that the flavor, in its purest form, is the shared human experience of breaking bread. It is a testament to the director's patience that such a profound conclusion is reached through the smallest of gestures, affirming that the most enduring legacies are often those that adapt quietly into the everyday fabric of life, long after the dramatic search has ended. The film's resolution achieves a profound sense of ecological balance, suggesting that true cultural continuity requires both deep roots and the ability to reach toward new sunlight. The protagonist's final role is not that of a historical curator locked in the past, but a living conduit, someone who has internalized the grammar of the tradition so thoroughly that he can now improvise within its structure. This mastery is evidenced in his willingness to let the younger generation bring their own contemporary influences, a novel ingredient perhaps, or a slight deviation in serving style, without feeling that the ancestral foundation is threatened. This willingness to embrace slight imperfection in the service of ongoing relevance mirrors the subtle evolution seen in the careers of many celebrated artists who master a classical form only to then subtly bend its rules for contemporary expression. The film subtly implies that the flavor was never truly lost. It was merely awaiting a translator fluent in both the ancient dialect and the modern tongue. This fluency is reflected in the protagonist's demeanor. The rigid posture of the obsessed researcher has been replaced by the relaxed, grounded presence of a craftsman secure in his purpose. The emotional payoff is not explosive satisfaction, but deep, settled peace. When the final dish is tasted by the new student, their reaction is not one of awe at a replication of a distant memory, but of immediate, unmediated pleasure in the present moment. This validates the entire journey. The goal was never to recreate a photograph of the past, but to ignite a new, immediate sensory experience that honors the labor behind it. The soundscape during this final tasting is deliberately sparse, perhaps only the quiet sounds of chewing and ambient, gentle background music, forcing the audience to focus entirely on the visceral act of nourishment. Ultimately, Jejak Rasa yang Hilang functions as a powerful meditation on legacy in an accelerating world. It argues that the flavor we seek is less a static object and more the dynamic process of seeking, tasting, learning, and transmitting. The trail, the Jejak, is not the destination, but the path walked with intention. By linking the meticulous, almost ritualistic labor of traditional cooking to the complex emotional geography of identity, the film secures its place as a sensitive examination of what it truly means to inherit something meaningful across the chasm of time. The film's enduring philosophical strength lies in its sophisticated understanding of ritual versus routine. The initial phase of the protagonist's quest is characterized by ritualistic adherence, the exact measurement, the prescribed timing, the almost fearful reverence for the ancient texts or recipes. This reflects an external, somewhat sterile approach to heritage, a desire to conquer tradition through precision, which often characterizes those new to a field, mirroring the initial, often overly formal stage in many creative careers before true internalization occurs. The elder custodians, however, operate on a level of routine so ingrained it has become second nature, an almost subconscious flow that cannot be taught through recitation. Their wisdom exists in the muscle memory, the intuitive knowing of when the oil shimmers just right, or when the dough has achieved the necessary elasticity through touch alone. This distinction becomes the turning point for the protagonist's emotional breakthrough. He realizes that his initial failures stem from treating the process as a series of discrete steps to be checked off, rather than a holistic experience to be inhabited. This realization often manifests in a moment of voluntary surrender, perhaps purposefully dropping a modern measuring device and simply using the pinch or palm-full measurement advocated by the elder. This gesture is the deepest form of respect shown, an acknowledgement that true mastery involves relinquishing the illusion of absolute control. The cinematic treatment of time during these pivotal moments reinforces this emotional arc. When the protagonist finally enters the state of intuitive routine, the film's editing often slows down, becoming almost impressionistic. We see long takes where the camera follows the movement of his hands, allowing the audience to synchronize their own internal pacing with the deliberate actions on screen. This tactile immersion bypasses intellectual understanding, moving straight to embodied knowledge. It suggests that the director, perhaps inspired by slower, more contemplative European cinema focusing on craft, is deliberately using duration as a narrative tool to signify depth and authenticity. Furthermore, the exploration of flavor loss also touches upon the theme of authenticity in the age of replication technology. If the film hints at the availability of modern substitutes or laboratory-grown flavor compounds, the protagonist's rejection of them is absolute. This isn't just cultural purism, it's a statement on value. The effort, the imperfection, and the connection to a specific patch of earth, these are the invisible, unquantifiable ingredients that hold the true worth. The flavor that is lost is the flavor that cannot be easily mass-produced or easily named on an ingredient's label. It is the flavor of earned experience, a narrative substance that synthetic imitation can never replicate. This quiet rebellion against convenience is perhaps the most resonant political statement the film makes. The film's nuanced portrayal of sensory input extends beyond taste and touch into the realm of olfactory memory, an often underrepresented dimension in cinematic storytelling. The scent of wood smoke clinging to dried herbs, the sharp, metallic tang of freshly pounded brass tools, or the particular earthy perfume of wet clay pots. These are subtly layered into the soundscape and visual texture, acting as invisible anchors for the protagonist's emotional regression. This dedication to the full spectrum of sensory experience demonstrates the filmmaker's commitment to total immersion, suggesting a cinematic philosophy akin to those directors who prioritize world-building through minute detail, where the environment itself breathes with history. The conflict surrounding the protagonist's background, his potential alienation from the very culture he seeks to reclaim, is skillfully managed by avoiding overly simplistic good versus bad dichotomies. His previous success in a modern field likely instilled a high degree of analytical thinking, which is both a hindrance and, eventually, a bridge. He initially tries to dissect the flavor scientifically, perhaps even attempting to chart volatile aromatic compounds. The elders, conversely, treat his analytical approach with bemused tolerance, understanding that the language of the kitchen is one of analogy and metaphor, not equations. This tension between empirical data and intuitive wisdom forms a compelling subplot, revealing how different generations process and value knowledge transfer. Moreover, the visual language employed when depicting the protagonist's own moments of culinary failure deserves attention. Unlike the warm glow surrounding the elder's work, his mistakes are often shot in cooler, harsher light, perhaps illuminated by overhead, non-atmospheric lighting, emphasizing sterility and isolation. When a dish fails, the camera lingers on the resulting texture, soggy, burnt, or curdled, presenting these imperfections not as mere mistakes, but as evidence of a missing emotional or philosophical key. This contrasts sharply with the inherent forgiveness found in the traditional methods, where slightly scorched elements might simply be stirred deeper into the sauce to impart a complex, smoky depth. The emotional journey seems to orbit around the concept of humility. The protagonist must shed the arrogance inherent in believing that knowledge acquired formally is superior to knowledge earned through repetition and connection to place. His gradual acceptance of being ignorant, of being a beginner again, is the true catalyst for success. This theme resonates deeply with the biographies of many renowned artists who, having achieved initial success, deliberately step away from the limelight to apprentice under different masters or study forgotten techniques, prioritizing depth of craft over public acclaim. The film quietly suggests that for true flavor or true art to emerge, one must first be willing to taste failure repeatedly, grounding the grand search for heritage in the humble reality of daily practice. The film deftly explores the internal landscape of grief that often accompanies the pursuit of lost heritage, suggesting that the lost flavor is intrinsically tied to the absence of the people who once made it. The protagonist's longing often manifests as a quiet ache, especially when encountering an object saturated with the memory of a specific person, perhaps a worn wooden cutting board etched with initials or a specific type of worn ceramic bowl. These moments transform the culinary quest into a form of elaborate, edible seance, an attempt to commune with the past through shared sensory ritual. This emotional underpinning elevates the film beyond mere culinary anthropology. It becomes a narrative about processing absence and finding ways to keep the echoes of loved ones present. The subtle characterization of the protagonist's professional past, hinted at through his immaculate yet soulless attire in early scenes, suggests a career demanding high-stakes performance and immediate results, perhaps in finance or cutting-edge technology. This background makes his sudden immersion in a world governed by the slow, cyclical rhythms of nature and seasonality feel jarringly alien. His initial inability to wait for the dough to rise or the broth to clarify perfectly is a direct symptom of a professional life where waiting is synonymous with failure. The film subtly critiques the modern obsession with instant gratification by showing how patience itself becomes a critical, unlearnable ingredient in this ancient craft. The directorial focus on the hands of the older generation, their texture, their gestures, serves as a powerful counterpoint to the protagonist's initially stiff, self-conscious movements. These hands are the true protagonists, repositories of unwritten knowledge. They move with an authority that needs no verbal confirmation, illustrating the profound difference between knowing a recipe and knowing how to cook. We see moments where the elder breaks eye contact with the protagonist, not out of rudeness, but because their concentration is focused entirely on the confluence of heat, moisture, and ingredient, a state of flow that cannot tolerate divided attention. This intensity demands respect and forces the protagonist to abandon intellectual analysis in favor of sympathetic mirroring. Furthermore, the geographical setting is treated not just as a backdrop, but as an active participant shaping the flavor. The specific mineral content of the local water, the unique microclimate affecting the fermentation, or the soil quality of the spice gardens are all subtly woven into the dialogue and visuals. This highlights the deep, inextricable link between terroir and taste, a concept often lost in industrialized food systems where ingredients are homogenized for global distribution. By insisting on the use of locally sourced, seasonal components, the film champions a localized, almost ecological approach to sustenance, suggesting that cultural identity is physically rooted in the land. The search for the lost flavor becomes, therefore, a search for belonging to a specific place. The film masterfully navigates the delicate space between preservation and stagnation, a philosophical tightrope walk that defines the aspirations of many modern cultural commentators and revivalists. The protagonist's eventual integration into the community of tradition bearers is marked by a shift in his relationship with failure. Initially, every setback is a personal defeat, a confirmation of his outsider status. However, the elders teach him that failure in this context is merely data, a necessary step toward understanding the ingredient's unique response to the moment. This reframing of error is perhaps the most valuable inheritance he receives, representing a profound liberation from the zero-sum performance metrics of his earlier career. This newfound tolerance for imperfection allows for moments of genuine creativity. Once the foundational grammar is understood, the protagonist begins to experiment tentatively, not to revolutionize the recipe, but to adapt it for the present day without sacrificing its soul. This evolution mirrors the journey of musicians who master classical composition only to infuse jazz or contemporary rhythms into their work. The film suggests that authenticity is not static. It is a dynamic equilibrium maintained through continuous, respectful interaction with the past. Visually, this maturation is often underscored by the lighting during their collaborative cooking sessions. The early scenes utilized sharp contrasts, emphasizing the protagonist's struggle against the darkness of the unknown. The later scenes, however, are bathed in an even, warm diffusion, as if the kitchen itself has become a source of internal light, reflecting the clarity achieved by the protagonist. The camera lingers on shared smiles, moments of mutual understanding communicated wordlessly over steam, highlighting the communal joy that was absent in his solitary, analytical pursuit. The emotional climax is not the successful dish, but the moment the protagonist realizes he no longer needs the approval of the elders. He has internalized their standards. This realization is often subtle, a confident adjustment of heat without consulting a thermometer, or the quiet dismissal of a specific, outdated tool in favor of a better improvised solution that respects the underlying principle. This autonomy marks his true graduation. He transforms from an archaeologist digging up relics into a gardener cultivating living tradition, ensuring that the flavors, though perhaps slightly altered by the passage of years and the hands that tend them, remain vital, recognizable, and, most importantly, edible for the generations yet to come. The lost flavor, it turns out, was never truly lost, only dormant, waiting for the right context to bloom again. The film's final testament to the meaning of legacy is found in its subtle exploration of sensory memory across multiple generations. The protagonist, having successfully navigated his own personal reconciliation with the past, now faces the challenge of ensuring this connection is not merely a brief, intense flicker in his own lifetime, but a sustainable flame for the future. The introduction of the youngest character, perhaps a child of the protagonist or a local youth completely untouched by the modernizing pressures the protagonist fled, acts as a necessary emotional reset button. This child interacts with the food and the process with uninhibited curiosity, untainted by the baggage of either nostalgia or professional anxiety. The protagonist's teaching method with this new student is characterized by patience, born from hard-won experience. He no longer lectures on theory. Instead, he guides through shared experience, allowing the child to make mistakes that lead to accidental discoveries. This reflects a mature artistic sensibility, similar to a seasoned musician, allowing a student to experiment with dissonance to better understand harmony. The elder characters observe this transition with quiet approval, their skepticism replaced by a sense of fulfilled duty. Their reward is not the perfect dish, but the visual evidence of the chain unbroken. The physical environment itself seems to respond to this harmony. If the initial segments were marked by dust and shadows representing obscurity, the final scenes are filled with bright, natural light streaming into the kitchen, perhaps illuminating motes of flour dancing in the air, a visual metaphor for the vitality that returns when tradition is actively practiced rather than passively venerated. This aesthetic choice is crucial. It grounds the spiritual quest in the tangible, material reality of the kitchen space, suggesting that transcendence is found in the immediate, physical engagement with the world. The film concludes not with a grand pronouncement, but with an intimate, resonant sound. The simple, satisfied sigh of the child tasting the finished product for the first time. This sound carries the weight of the entire narrative. It signifies acceptance, continuation, and the immediate, visceral proof that the connection, though altered by time and journey, has been successfully reforged. The lost flavor is thus redefined. It is not a single fixed taste, but the continuity of human intention expressed through nourishment, a tradition that thrives only when it is actively, lovingly, and imperfectly replicated in the present. The final image leaves the audience with the sense that the true success lies not in the historical accuracy of the recipe, but in the ongoing, warm and shared act of cooking. The film's ultimate success lies in its refusal to present a closed, perfected loop. The final scenes, while steeped in warmth and familial continuity, subtly hint at the next necessary evolution, ensuring the narrative avoids the complacency of a fully resolved ending. The protagonist, now fluent in both the modern language of efficiency and the ancient dialect of intuition, becomes the agent of necessary, gentle disruption. His mentorship of the youngest student is not simply about passing down the wisdom of the elders. It's about filtering that wisdom through the lens of the 21st century, a process that inevitably requires thoughtful alteration. Consider the incorporation of a single, seemingly minor, modern element into the ancient process. Perhaps the protagonist utilizes a meticulously calibrated piece of modern, non-invasive equipment, not to replace a traditional tool, but to measure the consistency of the traditional output, using modern data to better understand the elders' intuitive benchmarks. This might manifest as him using a simple digital thermometer to precisely record the temperature curve achieved by the traditional wood-fired oven, thereby creating a bridge of quantifiable understanding for his future self, or students who might lack access to the perfect, specific hearth. This act is deeply symbolic. It is the educated mind respectfully engaging with, rather than submitting to or rejecting, the past. The emotional undercurrent shifts here from reconciliation to responsibility. The protagonist now carries the burden not of recovery, but of translation and curation for a future that demands both rootedness and adaptability. His expressions, though peaceful, now carry a hint of thoughtful melancholy, the understanding that every act of preservation is also an act of necessary revision. He recognizes that the tradition he found was already an evolution of what came before it, and his role is to ensure its viability, not its immutability. Visually, the camera lingers less on the revered, ancient tools and more on the juxtaposition of materials. The worn, dark wood of the ancestral counter meeting a clean, newly polished surface where the protagonist organizes his notes. The colors remain warm, but the composition gains a sharper, more defined structure, reflecting the synthesis of soul and system. This final aesthetic move confirms the film's central thesis. The most potent cultural inheritance is not static history preserved under glass, but a living practice intelligently adapted for survival in a changing world. The final, quiet triumph is the realization that the Jejak, the trail, is only meaningful if it continues to be trodden, even if the footsteps change their rhythm slightly along the way. The film's closing sequence subtly introduces the theme of external validation versus intrinsic satisfaction, a final hurdle for the protagonist to clear. Having achieved internal peace and the successful transmission of knowledge, he faces the inevitable, albeit perhaps unintended, consequence of his celebrated journey: external recognition. A brief, almost intrusive suggestion of this might appear: a polite inquiry from an unseen journalist via a distant phone call, or the arrival of a glossy food critics card left discreetly on the doorstep. These tokens represent the very world he sought to escape: the commodification of authenticity, the turning of lived experience into marketable narrative. The protagonist's reaction to this intrusion is telling, marking the definitive separation between the obsessive seeker and the fulfilled master. He does not engage, nor does he violently reject the offering. Instead, his response is one of gentle, profound indifference. He might simply place the critic's card beneath a mortar and pestle, allowing the weight of tangible craft to settle over the ephemeral promise of fame. This is not arrogance. It is the quiet confidence of someone whose reward system has been entirely internalized. The external noise of acclaim simply cannot penetrate the resonant silence achieved within the kitchen walls. The supporting cast of elders, particularly the cynical former apprentice, offers a final, nuanced reaction to this potential external fanfare. Rather than celebrating the protagonist's success as vindication, their response is one of guarded acceptance. The cynic might offer a single, knowing nod, a recognition that the young man has successfully navigated the pitfalls of modern attention without becoming enslaved by them. This validates the protagonist's journey, not just in terms of cooking, but in terms of ethics, confirming that he has learned how to honor the tradition without selling its essence. The directorial hand then moves away from the detailed close-ups of ingredients, shifting focus entirely to the landscape surrounding the community. The final, sweeping drone shot might show the kitchen nestled securely within the vibrant, working landscape. The fields, the smoke rising from other hearths, the interconnectedness of the small community. This visual broadening suggests that the flavor is not confined to a single dish or a single person, but is woven into the entire ecosystem of sustained, meaningful labor. The emotional resonance here is one of belonging. The protagonist is no longer visiting his heritage. He is organically part of the place that sustains it. The film doesn't end with a perfect meal, but with the promise of another day of honest work, underscoring that the true legacy is the enduring rhythm of life itself. The final, evocative shift in the film's conclusion moves beyond personal reconciliation and even communal stewardship, venturing into the philosophical realm of narrative surrender. The protagonist, having mastered the technique and found peace in the transmission, must now confront the ultimate paradox of storytelling. To truly honor a memory, one must be willing to let the story itself conclude without embellishment. This stage is marked by a deliberate withdrawal from the performance of tradition. The scenes become quieter, stripped of even the soft background music that has accompanied the later mentorship phases. When the protagonist finally shares the perfected dish, perhaps with the original elder, now frail but lucid, there is no need for analysis, no exchange of technical notes. The act of eating becomes purely devotional. The silence is not tense, but heavy with shared understanding, a mutual acknowledgement that the search has reached its natural terminus. The protagonist doesn't need the elder's verbal affirmation. The subtle relaxation in the elder's posture, the slight softening around the eyes as they taste, is the only validation required. This acceptance of silence mirrors the artistic maturity of directors who understand that the most powerful cinematic moments often occur just outside the frame, in the audience's internal reflection. The protagonist ceases to be the active collector of data or the narrator of the journey. He becomes, instead, the vessel through which the experience flows, empty of ego and fully present in the moment of shared sustenance. This represents the final shedding of his ambitious, hyper-analytical self, a surrender to the simple, unadorned reality of the present. Visually, the camera might pull back further than ever before during this final communal meal. The focus is not exclusively on the food or the faces, but on the entire tableau, the weathered table, the quality of the afternoon light entering the room, the shadows cast by the familiar domestic architecture. This wide shot signifies that the protagonist has finally integrated the flavor not just into his cooking, but into his entire perception of the world. The kitchen is no longer a laboratory or a shrine. It is simply home. The film's final shot, perhaps lingering on the protagonist cleaning the implements, not with anxious perfection, but with a steady, practiced rhythm, is a quiet affirmation. He is not preserving relics, he is preparing for tomorrow's meal. The Jejak is no longer a difficult trail to follow backward, but the well-worn path leading forward. The true flavor that was recovered was not the taste of his youth, but the taste of a life lived fully, intentionally, and now quietly complete, ready to absorb whatever new memories the next generation will create upon its foundation. Hello everyone, and a warm welcome to the Complex in MA channel. If you're new here, please consider subscribing and hitting that like button to show your support. Today, we are going to be discussing the film Jejak Rasa yang Hilang. The film unfolds with a quiet intensity, drawing us into the meticulous world of culinary artistry, where memory and flavor are inextricably linked. We are introduced to the protagonist, a chef whose reputation precedes him, known for an almost obsessive dedication to traditional Indonesian flavors, particularly those rooted in the Minangkabau heritage of West Sumatra. His cooking isn't just sustenance, it's a form of narrative, a way to keep the past alive. This dedication, we soon learn, is fueled by a deep, almost painful nostalgia, a yearning for a taste only his grandmother could perfectly evoke. His journey is not a straightforward rise to fame, but rather an internal struggle reflected in the precise calibration of spices. We see glimpses of his early training, perhaps absorbing techniques from seasoned masters in bustling city kitchens. Yet always feeling a fundamental piece was missing, the authentic rasa, the soul of the flavor. This drives him to seek out the origins, the ancestral recipes that have been diluted or lost in modern interpretations. The narrative gains momentum when he encounters a younger character, perhaps a food critic or a fellow aspiring chef, someone who represents the contemporary appreciation for fusion and rapid innovation. This juxtaposition is crucial. One clings to the immutable past, the other races toward an unknown future. Their initial interactions are marked by professional skepticism, the veteran dismissing the newcomer's work as superficial, while the younger generation views the traditionalist as stagnant. A turning point arrives through the discovery of an old, perhaps partially burned, recipe book or a crucial, almost mythical, ingredient source hidden deep within the Minangkabau highlands. This quest takes the protagonist away from the sterile environment of fine dining and into the vibrant, challenging landscape of rural life, forcing him to reconnect with the land and the people whose lives are interwoven with the ingredients themselves. He revisits old techniques, slow smoking, specific fermentation processes that require patience, a commodity often lacking in the fast-paced culinary world he left behind. As he painstakingly recreates the lost flavors, guided by fragmented memories and the wisdom of village elders, the film subtly explores themes of legacy and identity. His professional ambition transforms into a desire for filial piety, a way to honor the spirit of his grandmother, who likely inspired him not just with her cooking, but with her resilience and connection to her community. We witness the transformation not just in the food he produces, which becomes richer and more resonant, but in the chef himself. The rigidity softens, replaced by a profound understanding that true mastery lies in interpretation, not mere replication. The climax isn't a grand culinary competition, but rather an intimate sharing of food, perhaps a meal prepared for the very community that preserved the knowledge he sought. The younger character, initially skeptical, tastes the food and experiences a moment of genuine revelation, finally understanding the depth beneath the traditional facade. The film suggests that the true lost flavor wasn't just a spice blend, but the context, the love, and the shared history embedded in every mouthful. The narrative concludes not with eternal success, but with a quiet acceptance. The flavor has been rediscovered, the memory honored, and the legacy passed on, ensuring that the Jejak Rasa, the trace of flavor, will endure. The air in the protagonist's kitchen, even in his celebrated establishment, always seemed faintly charged with the ghost of wood smoke, a testament to the culinary pilgrimage he was perpetually undertaking. He was a man carved from discipline, his hands bearing the faint scars of countless burns, each one a minor punctuation mark in the epic poem of his dedication to ancestral cooking. His inspiration, the spectral presence in every perfectly balanced sample, was his grandmother, a woman whose kitchen was the very epicenter of their world, a place where patience wasn't a virtue, but the primary cooking medium. She wasn't a famous chef. She was the keeper of the flame, her knowledge passed down through shared silence and the rhythmic pounding of mortar and pestle. The younger foil, perhaps named Ryan, represented the glossy, highly publicized world of modern gastronomy, a chef who favored molecular foams over slow reductions, whose inspiration was drawn from international glossy magazines rather than the earth beneath his feet. When Ryan first sampled the protagonist's rendition of a classic rendang, he likely critiqued its texture as too rustic, missing the foundational truth that the roughness was the integrity itself. The older chef's frustration wasn't merely professional, it was existential. He felt that by chasing accolades in sterile environments, he was allowing the very soul of his heritage to evaporate into the high-altitude air of elite dining rooms. The quest for the elusive ingredient led them not to a supplier, but to a matriarch deep in the valleys, an elder whose memory was sharper than any cookbook. This woman didn't measure in grams. She measured in feelings, in the humidity of the morning, in the sound the coconut milk made when it kissed the searing wok. The journey demanded physical sacrifice from the protagonist, forcing him to shed the pampered skin of the successful urban chef. He found himself sleeping on woven mats, his usually immaculate chef whites stained with the red earth, learning to coax flavor from ingredients he'd previously dismissed as mere raw materials. The real revelation wasn't the final recipe, but the understanding that the intensity of the taste was directly proportional to the human connection woven into its making. When the elder finally shared the forgotten preparation method, perhaps involving the unique curing of a specific type of local chili using rainwater collected only during the monsoon season, the emotion that washed over the protagonist was profound relief mixed with sorrow. It was the feeling of grasping something vital just before it slipped away forever. This wasn't just about seasoning a dish. It was about resecuring his place in the lineage, proving to the ghost of his grandmother that her arduous life's work hadn't been in vain. Ryan, witnessing this near-religious devotion, begins to understand that innovation without roots is just noise. When he finally tastes the dish, prepared under the guidance of the protagonist and the watchful eye of the elder, his sophisticated palate is momentarily silenced. It's not just flavor, it's memory made edible, a complex tapestry of smoke, earth, and unspoken love that transcends mere technique. The film leaves us with the quiet dignity of a tradition successfully carried forward, not as a museum piece, but as a living, breathing expression of identity sustained by the careful tending of its past. The protagonist carried the weight of his entire culinary lineage on his shoulders, a burden that manifested in the perpetual tension around his jawline. His focus was often so intense that the hustle of his acclaimed restaurant seemed to recede around him, leaving him isolated in the precise geometry of his plating. We glimpse moments, perhaps late at night, when the stainless steel counters reflected the harsh overhead light, where he would close his eyes, trying desperately to isolate the exact inflection in his grandmother's voice when she spoke of the importance of santan, the coconut cream. She wasn't just teaching him to cook, she was instilling a philosophy where waste was a sin, and every ingredient possessed a spirit that demanded respect. Ryan, the young modernist, initially viewed the older chef's adherence to tradition as a form of self-imposed mediocrity. Ryan's ambition was fueled by global recognition. He dreamed of Michelin stars whispered about in distant, snow-capped cities, while the protagonist was obsessed with the approval of the ancestors, whispering in the smoke of the hearth. Ryan's early attempts to elevate Minangkabau dishes involved replacing crucial, slow-rendered fats with lighter oils, a modernization that the older chef viewed as nothing less than cultural erasure. The clash was passionate, sometimes erupting into sharp exchanges over the proper aging of dried spices, where Ryan saw tedious bureaucracy and the protagonist saw sacred ritual. The descent into the highlands was physically taxing for the established chef. His designer chef shoes were ruined almost immediately on the muddy paths leading to the source of the special turmeric they needed, a variety that only grew on slopes irrigated by a particular mineral spring. He had to learn to communicate not through technical culinary jargon, but through gestures and patience with the local farmers, whose relationship with the earth was instinctive and unbroken. There was a poignant scene where, having failed repeatedly to extract the right intensity of flavor from a new batch of herbs, he breaks down, admitting to the village elder that his years of formal training have made him deaf to the subtler cues of nature. It was a moment of professional humility that unlocked the true sensory pathway. The elder woman, whose hands were gnarled like ancient tree roots, didn't offer solutions. She offered experiences. She made the chef chew on raw, unwashed roots until he could distinguish the inherent bitterness from the desired earthiness. This sensory overload served to strip away the intellectual layers he had built around his craft. He realized that the lost flavor was less about a specific ingredient and more about the unhurried reverence afforded to the preparation process. The final meal they prepared together was not meant for critique. It was an offering. When Ryan finally tasted it, a humble stew elevated by perfect textural balance and deep, layered umami, his usual stream of analytical commentary ceased. He didn't speak of mouthfeel or presentation. He simply closed his eyes, a rare, genuine moment of quiet awe, replacing his habitual bravado. The enduring power of the film lies in this silent communication. The flavor, rediscovered, acted as the only necessary language, bridging the generational and ideological gap with a single, perfect taste. The resolution brought a quiet transformation, not the triumphant roar of a victorious chef, but the deep, resonant hum of a debt repaid to memory. The protagonist, having shed the armor of his urban success, returned to the city not to flaunt his newfound knowledge, but to integrate it seamlessly. His restaurant menu subtly shifted. The dramatic flair remained, the meticulous presentation still evident. But beneath the surface, the foundation was entirely different. Slower, deeper, more honest. Patrons, accustomed to his prior brilliance, began noticing a profound difference. The food now had a haunting persistence on the palate, an almost narrative